Okay, so let's begin with Sigmund Freud's interpretation of religion and the religious structure of the mind. Now, from what I talked about before and how I introduced Freud was, what was his view of religion in general? Do you remember? Was he a very religious man? Okay, so no answer. But anyways, Sigmund Freud was not a religious man, and he was quite the opposite. He was very atheist and had a very negative view of religion in general. So keep that in mind. Now, brief history, brief bio. Sigmund Freud was born in May 6, 1856, in a small town, which is Freiburg, which was Freiburg, and today is called Schibor, which is in Moravia. And by the way, has anyone visited this town or been to his childhood home?
I never did, but I would like to. Maybe after quarantine, when we cannot go out of the country, just within the country. But
Right.
did you go?
Yes, I was there. I visited about 2 years ago, and it's not far from Ostrava. And it was an interesting, it was an interesting experience. I don't think it's as good as the Freud Museum in Vienna, but it's worth the visit. And it was kind of interesting how they had laid out his room, and they had his books, they had some of his items that he liked to hold on to, and there was a drawer inside his room, and when you opened the drawer, like, there was the book Moses and Monotheism, which was his final book and one of the more controversial books, which we will talk about in a little bit. But it was interesting that it was also put inside the locker and hidden, because many of his fans or many psychoanalysts didn't like that book, and it was very controversial from its publication. And it's only being reconsidered now as being a very interesting analysis and having many layers to it. So I will go into it in a little bit. So Sigmund Freud's background in terms of religion is Jewish, but he quickly rejected religion and became an atheist. And he was always into mythology throughout his life. Now, in his life, he did witness anti-Semitism against his father, and he himself had a very strong dislike for his father. His father was a very distant figure, and he didn't ever really get along with him, but he did get along very much with his mother, and this is something of a recurring theme in Freud's theories. Freud was influenced by two primary thoughts or modes of philosophy, and one was reductionism, which today, rightfully so, doesn't have a very good connotation, but it's the essence of a lot of our scientific theories, is basically understanding concepts by getting to their smallest form. So, for example, if we go back to the theory of ancient Greece of atomism, so looking at atoms as the building blocks of the world. And today we can see this type of reductionist theories in most everything. So if you look at health, you can look at things like the germ theory. You have certain germs, they take over, you get disease. It's the opposite. The reductionist view is the opposite of the systems view. It's the opposite of the holistic view. But it was a big, it was considered a big philosophical movement of science in the late 1800s. And he was also very influenced by the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. And throughout his life, he was his favorite philosopher. And so he never even tried to analyze Nietzsche's writings. And he was saying they're too, they're too sacred to be analyzed. And that's very interesting from Freud's perspective. And it seems like he had kind of an inferiority complex towards Friedrich Nietzsche. It was one of the few people that he really saw as intellectually superior than himself. And you can get kind of an idea of his personality. He was also influenced by Roman Catholic thought. He had a maid, the family had a maid who was very religious, and he was always intrigued by Catholic Christianity. And you could say it was even biasing a little bit his thought on Christianity, because he only saw that side of it. So he was part of a big family, and I always mention these things. I said, like last time, when I talk about psychoanalysts, since the whole theory of psychoanalysis is the importance of childhood and the childhood influences. I always like to go into it. Now in terms of relevant subjects for this class, he was basically influenced by myths, ancient myths. Can anyone think of one that is famous in his theories?
Oedipus?
Yes, exactly. So the Oedipus complex would be a perfect example of that. And I believe there's other figures that we will get into as well from ancient Greece that impacted him. Does anyone know? Like the figure of Eros and Thanatos. Well, it's fine. We will talk about that in a minute. So his intuition was that religion and myth are interchangeable. They tell stories that are applicable to human reality. Now, I don't particularly agree with this notion, but this is his interpretation, and that basically that was his intuition from an early age. And he believed that psychoanalysis and his theories could be the key to understanding figures such as the pharaohs, such as biblical characters, and he really liked to get into these discussions, even with Carl Jung, about the characters of like ancient Egypt or some of the historical figures, and there's a lot of very interesting writings on that. Now, this is some of his one quote about the influence and the strong impact that his mother had as treating him so well and keeping that connection, which in his analysis gave him more confidence and more of a spirit of conquering that would be becoming useful throughout his life. I mentioned that his father, he didn't have a good impression, and he would even write about sexual abuse. Now, whether that's accurate or not, that is really a controversial topic, and it's one of the most controversial topics within psychoanalysis. Is called the seduction theory of neurosis, which basically entails that most of our neuroses or mental issues come from early childhood trauma, where we've been inappropriately exposed to sex in some way or another, or touched or abused. And this has been one of the most censored theories, and he even self-censored it because it would be such an outrage. And by the way, a lot of his writings are secret. They're not, a lot of his diaries were not released, and they're kept by his family. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. Now, in terms of interest and the theoretical background of Sigmund Freud, Freud was very fond of hypnosis and mesmerism, which was the precursor to hypnosis. or at least the precursor to the medical implementation of hypnosis. And he was studying under Charcot in Paris. And by the way, I would just like to mention that Charcot was teaching also at Charles University in Prague. He came as a visiting professor, and if you go to the first faculty of medicine, the Department of Psychiatry, they have a big book where there's all the world famous professors who've taught, and there's Charcot signature there, and you can check it out. He followed up, he studied also under Joseph Breuer, and who's another noted hypnotist. Now, if you understand hypnosis and a lot of the theories of hypnosis, you can kind of get where a lot of Freud's theories come from, a lot of psychoanalytic theories come from. Because with hypnosis and classical hypnosis, there's these modes of induction, which can, some of them are related to early life attachment. So there's this theory in classical hypnosis where you try to get to understand the person and see where their commands are easily listened to by trying to make very stereotypical masculine or feminine sounds, and they see, and you have to be a classical hypnotist, you have to be extremely like attentive to their responses, their physical responses. And if they come towards you, if they move slightly towards you, when you make a specific sound, it indicates whether they're more close to their father, or they're missing the father figure or the mother figure, and that helps you to get them into this suggestive state, altered state. And so if you understand this in terms of theory, you can see the impact that hypnosis had on Freudian theory in general. Freud didn't, he wasn't particularly good at hypnosis from what I've read. And so he made a different theory from it. And instead of getting people hypnotized and lowering their defenses and letting them speak and asking them questions, he developed the technique of free association. And free association is where you're laying down, well, you don't have to lay down, but you're basically free to let your thoughts and words run freely. So I might give you a subject, for example, childhood, and you just let everything flow through your words, like without a filter. That's the point. You can't filter, you can't censor, just everything goes out. And the role of the therapist is then to find certain meanings, certain associations, and then share it with you and see if it resonates. Okay, going a bit in depth here. Now, if you go to the Freud Museum in Vienna, and also at his house, there's part of his collection of artifacts from Egyptian culture. And from a historical perspective, there was the invasion of Egypt, the Egyptian conquest by Napoleon in the 1800s, and this created a huge craze, or a huge obsession with ancient Egypt in Europe. And there were all kinds of books and fictions about the Egyptian mysteries and the magic of Egypt, which is very interesting. And Freud was definitely influenced by it. And you can see his desk here. There's various statues, collections from all over the world, a lot of Egypt especially. Now, in terms of the impact of Western culture, and those taken cultural psych, I talk about it, but the concept of the unconscious mind was popularized by Sigmund Freud, and the idea of talking about sexuality openly and issues of sex were also something that Freud impacted in the culture. And I think, we in general don't even think about it today. We are just take it for granted. And even though Freud today is a bit controversial and a lot of people like to make fun of his theories, we are almost living in a Freudian construct because he's impacted our culture so much that we use his terms. We have like a lot of the ideas that he was writing about, we've just absorbed. So even if some of his ideas may sound silly, they are very much part of the culture. So it's something to think about. In terms of psychology, the importance of childhood and character formation, and the influence of childhood traumas in creating the ego or ourselves. Now, this is not controversial. This is something that is widely known and accepted today. And now, my personal take is that Freud's theories are extremely interesting, but in terms of therapeutic practice, I wouldn't use them. But that's just because of my character, and I think there's more short-term and effective therapies to use. Now, another thing that was brought to the mainstream, and I mean it was always in the folk culture, is the dreams, the importance of dreams and dreams analysis, and the concepts of the defense mechanisms in order to understand our personality, like what we're doing to, get anxiety away from us or to make us not feel uncomfortable. And you can see this in terms of some of the most important for me here are the concept of transference. And transference meaning when you find yourself in communicating with others, and usually it's written about in terms of the therapist, but it can be with anyone else. And especially if there's emotion involved, then you might put yourself or enter this sphere where you are going back to childhood dynamics of maybe you're acting like the little child and you're talking to your mom or you're talking to your parent. And this transference is very important to become aware of, because it's if we start to realize how we communicate and how we relate, that's very important for our mental health. And repression, the things like what are we repressing, and the incredible power of the unconscious influence. So again, like the unconscious could be things that come up that or being taken over by emotion. Let's say like someone has an anger issue. Well, someone with an anger issue isn't very conscious when the anger takes over. It's really like you're possessed by the anger, depending how much, if you worked on yourself at all. But if not, it's like you're being possessed, And if you want to use religious terms, it's like there's a demon inside you that's controlling you. Just a brief review. This is the very simple iceberg model for consciousness that Freud has. Now we have the conscious, like the ego, so what we show the world, and in terms of going to what Jung was saying, the persona would be the most superficial part, so it would be at the top of that iceberg. We have the superego, which is basically our filtering process of what we consider right and wrong. And this is beyond preconscious and conscious. So when we feel some kind of guilt or discomfort, it comes from the superego. And then we have the mass of the iceberg, which is under, and it's not seen, is obviously the unconscious. And there's the big id there, which is the id are all our primitive impulses, our animal side, let's say, our more uncontrolled side. And that's where you can find Jung's shadow as well in that part. And the id, though, you have to keep in mind, is also like part of the life force that drives us. Let's just go over this. Some of you have seen it already, and if so, I apologize, but some have not. So I have to mention it if we talk about this theory, or we will not understand the concept of psyche from Freud. So ego is part of the conscious mind, and it is our sense of who we think we are. It is our identities, and it's based on upbringing, culture, and environment, and ways we deal with our id drives or our unconscious destructive drives as well. It's based on reality, the reality principle, or the reality principle is basically the reality that we have to deal with in terms of our society, in terms of our culture, and pressures that are given to us. The id, again, is the unconscious, is in the unconscious. It's primal drives, sex, aggression, hunger, thirst, and it runs on pleasure principle. The id is like, I want pleasure, I want to deal with pleasure. And the superego, again, is that regulator or filter, and it's connected with parenting and development in the various psychosexual stages. So whether or not we were, fulfilling our needs, our desires in the various stages of development as children, as adolescents, or whether we were blocked, or we dealt with certain traumas or something that held us back, will impact our superego and will impact our ego. And it's basically, it's the rewarder or punisher, and it's the conscience, and it's basically the ego ideal. It's basically your compass. It's telling you, yes, what I'm doing is right, and I'm on the right path of becoming the person I want to be, or and this is Freud's. So I'm trying not to taint it with other later psychoanalysts, but it's basically like your own notion of who the best person you can be is. And it's not really your own, because you are not an island. You're impacted by family and culture. So it's a good way of thinking about it. Now, before I continue with this, I would like to do a very quick activity, and okay, so other terms that were popularized and brought into the mainstream mind by Freud are the terms libido, which is basically our life force, which in Chinese medicine it can be known as the qi, and it was expanded by his student Wilhelm Reich in a great way. I mean, Reich focused primarily on this, and he then believed that the libido can be actually quantified, and came up with the orgone theory, which I will talk about in a little bit. But the important thing to understand here is, again, this concept of polarity. If you recall, with Jung, this was one of the key aspects of his theory, but it was also in Freud's theory. And I mention that because we should think of these psychoanalysis theories as being connected to each other. So Freud influenced Jung, of course, and so this is not two separate lines of thinking. It comes from the same source. And Freud's polarity and balance and this can be seen in the microcosm in people. So we have the balancing between the death drive, the THANATOS, and EROS, the life force. And these are in opposition. So if you want to be really dark. You can think of the death drive taking over when you have violence, or when you have things like the violence turned inside in ourselves. So it could be suicide. It could be, and this would also be like self-harm in the forms of even drug abuse, especially hard drugs. We could see that as being kind of like the THANATOS force taking over and destroying ourselves. And the EROS is the life force, and it's connected with love as well, and sex. And these two are in balance in everyday life. And in e-learning, I have there the book Civilization and Its Discontents. And this is an optional read, but if you want to understand this theory from a social perspective, Freud is there analyzing the societal impacts of these two forces, and the notion that society is not a proof of our advanced status or advanced evolutionary state, but is actually reality, that we need these kind of controlling structures that keep these in order. So I believe that some of the constraints also of things like work, and necessitating things like taxes are not very pleasant, but they're necessary to keep our consciousness, these unconscious drives in check. So that's a very interesting perspective, and I recommend you read it. So this I've already mentioned. Now I do want to talk about the book, or the expansion of Otto Rank and ultimately Ernst Becker, and the book The Denial of Death, which, by the way, has anyone here already covered terror management theory? No? I'm surprised.
Sorry, what was the question? If we know terror management theory?
Yeah, if you've had it already in a psychology class.
Yeah, we have had it in social psychology class, as well as some other classes. Yeah, and it basically talks about death being the main reason behind the way people act, the anxiety of death,
Yeah.
their motivation to avoid death, and it tends as a reason behind like the way our societies are developed.
Right. So the ultimate anxiety and denial of our ultimate death, how we deal with this, and terror management theory was created by a group of psychologists, and it's basically a quantified version of Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death. But The Denial of Death, the book, was basically what laid the groundwork for that theory. And if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend that book. It's probably one of the most important books in psychology, and it's basically putting an existential spin on Freud's theories. And Ernest Becker wrote that book as he was dying. So he had a terminal disease, so he was living through these things, and so he took this deep analysis, and he also commented quite correctly that very often in academic psychology we kind of we don't really go into depth into like Freud's later work. We focus only on his early theories, and it's unfortunate because you can see his the evolution of his thinking and how it was becoming more and more existential rather than being stuck in the early ideas. So it's and moving into also like symbolism rather than being like looking at these aspects of consciousness being purely like real or there. being symbolic. So, and that makes it also go into a more societal level. So I want to mention that because in terms of terror management and religion, well, there's this idea of the promise of religion is very often immortality or the survival of the soul. And so very often we take this as a very good kind of way of renegade, like having someone else's formula work for us for our denial of death situation. Now, this we will not look at now. I have two videos that you will look at in the third hour, which are related to terror management, and one is on heroism, and the second one is about the classic theory and how it connects to religion and consciousness. Now, this was, of course, Freud's writing as well on death and the denial of death. It comes from him, and where we have this, religion as having like a substituted father and mother figure. Now, that is not always accurate for all religions, and I think Freud here is sticking very much to this Christian and Judaic ideal, also of calling God the Father is not, it's not in all religions, right? So it's in Christianity primarily, it's in Judaism somewhat, and I believe it's not even allowed in Islam. Is that correct? For the Muslim students here, is that correct? In Islam, it's not allowed to call God the Father?
No, we're not allowed to.
Okay, so that's, so as you can see, so that would be an example. And again, go back to what I was talking about with Freud's early life influences, the distance of his father and the connection with the Catholic stories that were put in him. And for those who mentioned the prohibitions and the punishments as some of your early experiences with religion, well, Freud heard all about these these punishments from his Christian maid, and that greatly impacted his view of religion in general. Well, this is the idea Freud had, and again, I already mentioned, with civilization and its discontents. So the idea that if we have our irrational drives running wild, or being manipulated by tyrants or populists, and Freud saw World War I and World War II. He died right after World War II. We could really create monsters. And by the way, the monsters are created by ideologies very often. And this is something, and I mention this because this is where the Freudian ideal and the Reichian ideal split. So even though Wilhelm Reich had almost the same theories as Freud, here's where the split comes. Freud saw the unconscious id drives as being primarily evil and dark. And here again, you can kind of see the concept of the original sin. So we're already tainted in being incarnated as humans. And Reich saw the opposite. He thought that deep down, our drives are not evil, they're good, but the ideologies that we use to, let's say, channel these forces can deviate them into becoming evil. And or other ways and this is just one example, other ways would be also and Reich was big into the notion of control. and mind control through sexual repression. And so he believed that, and you can see this in religions, and all, or not all, but most religions have these strong taboos, and they're kind of unnatural in a way. And so they create a dispersion, like the energy which would be driven to love and sex will go to something else, and it can be good or bad. So that's important to note. And that's also one of the reasons why religions like Christianity, for example, and for monks and other people, there's this taboo of masturbation, because they want to force the energy to not be dispelled, but to go to worship, to go to these other realms that are not primal, that are not, let's say, lower, so quote unquote. So yeah, I already mentioned this. Freud believed this Nietzschean idea that religion is mostly for the weak-minded, weak-spirited. Nietzsche, of course, believed that the Übermensch, the Superman, would create his own moral system, his own religious thought, and after the death of God, we are the creators of our own morality, those who can do that, the Superman. And Freud really liked this idea, and he always regarded the religious thought as weak, but interestingly, it was something that kept influencing him, and he kept going back to and wanting to analyze. So it's you know, you think about it, it's really like he couldn't really escape it or get out of it. Now he saw this also as regression, and he very often wrote about religious thought making us regress into childhood states of consciousness, infantile consciousness, and yeah, and losing the sense of the self for conformity through consciousness. Also letting go of one's responsibilities, because you're, well, by going into a pre-made belief system and pre-made morality, you are pretty much, you know, you're letting go a lot of your responsibilities. And for wish fulfillment, this again, I would say it's limited to certain religions, with Christianity as one of his primary influences, with the mother goddess, with Mary, and with the father god. And this is, again, this is can be part of that wish fulfillment, or, you know, compensation of aspects of our life that weren't fulfilled. Now this I mentioned, and this is an art form from Austin Spare, but controlling the eros, or channeling the eros force to something else, and also the thanatos force. If you think about it, very often religions have an enemy as well. Like there's certain people that are outside that you may channel the thanatos. I think we're moving away from that, but it's been classically there in many religions, and especially religions that the monotheistic religions I mentioned 2 weeks ago, I believe, with one of Jung's criticisms from James Hillman from a pagan perspective, is that from the old pagan religions, there was never the concept of religious war, or proving that your religion is right and the other one is wrong. This was outside of the mode of thinking, because many of the pagan religions didn't really require faith. They didn't require this belief. It was kind of like talking about laws of nature. And so it was a totally different mental concept to hold on to. And so there was no thought about even the afterlife very often. It was not often talked about. It was just the world of shadows. And by the way, early Judaism also did not have an afterlife. was not a concept that that came into Judaism until much later on. So this is one of Freud's views as well, that religious, and he wrote a book on religion called The Future of an Illusion, and believing that religious beliefs are mostly illusions that have an evolutionary gain from them, that help people stay alive, not despair, keep the society in order at times. They reinforce the social order, the social norms. And they're not always, like the religious rules, they're not always followed by the people in power, right? So think about the Ten Commandments. Well, people in power are not always they're not always following those. When nations wage wars, they're killing, and that's so it becomes okay in that situation. So there's always, like this to think about. And yeah, you can see some of these ideas. And here's a quote from Freud. You can go over it. This is from his final book. This was actually part of the introduction to that book, so you get an idea. Now, I want to mention this this last book because it is quite interesting, and I believe, I'm not sure if you have it on e-learning. I have it here at my home. So I mentioned earlier in the class what the book's theory is about, and it's basically talking about the reign of Akhenaten in Egypt, who was basically the first Egyptian monotheistic ruler, and he abolished the previous cults, and cults in the sense of worship. He abolished the polytheism. And also, interestingly, this was at the time of Freud's life. A lot of the hieroglyphs from his time were translated, and so there were these prayers, and they were quite similar to a lot of the early Jewish prayers. And the sun was the primary form of the sun was worshipped as God, and that's how we understand it. But keep in mind that later on in Christianity, for example, there's a strong symbol with the sun, and a lot of people who don't know Catholic Christianity, for example, look at the sun and say, oh, look, they're worshiping the sun. But that is incorrect. The sun in Christianity is meant to be the closest we can get to God as a figure of light, but it's not meant to be God. It's just meant to be like an example of God's light. But there's God greater, of course, than this light. But here we see in this reign there was the title Father for God, which was given, and also, there were interesting prohibitions that came about during Akhenaten's reign, and one of them was the banning of magic spells, talismans, and things that were classically noted in ancient Egypt, and the culture and religion. It was all about that. And Akhenaten banned those practices, which is interesting because there is this same prohibition in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. So Freud's idea of this being an early precursor to Judaism is an interesting theory. It's not fully proven, but it's an interesting speculation to look at. And his theory was that Moses was actually a high priest in Egypt of Akhenaten, and that then was expelled because Akhenaten, for those of you who don't know, was murdered after the old priestly class conspired to kill him, and they did, and because it was too much for them to adopt this type of thinking. It was so alien, and Freud was ventured off and basically brought this monotheism to people, to the Canaanites and to other people. And Freud goes very deep into looking at the name of God as well. And he has the idea that the old Canaanite god named Yahweh, well spelled in modern words Jahbe, which was pretty much corresponding to Jupiter, was intermixed with Aton from Egypt, and from there we get the Yahweh, we get the Jewish God. That was Freud's theory. Now you can imagine when writing this book just how much controversy it sparked. And there was controversy among Catholics, there was controversy among Jews, especially the Orthodox Jews, and they didn't like it. But it was an interesting perspective, and he brought about this notion that actually the Canaanites had killed Moses, and later this kind of guilt plagued the mind of Jews forever on, and the collective guilt then transpired into the murder of Jesus, and this kind of guilt ideal swept into the Judeo-Christian culture, and there's a lot of other symbolisms you can draw from that, including the anti-Semitic ideals, and hunting the Jews when you're a Christian civilization, hunting down and persecuting the people who basically brought a lot of or laid the groundwork for your religion is very interesting. I have a video later on. So moving on, I want to mention some
Can I
of.
ask a question before?
Yeah.
Sorry. So did Freud see the monotheistic Egyptian tradition that Akhenaton proposed as a precursor to Judaism, for example?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, he believed that Judaism was the direct result of this monotheism, and he looked at, and if you go into the book, he also looked at a lot of the traditions that were started with Akhenaten that were very similar to early Judaism, and how a lot of the prohibitions, again, that I mentioned some, were very similar to later Jewish prohibitions, and how the Egyptians, the greater Egyptian culture, couldn't accept these things, and the class, the priestly class that were dwelling in magic and sorcery kind of became the face of evil later on in Jewish and Christian tradition and Islam, as like things you shouldn't do. And this was was kind of the primary modes of worship in Egypt. Egypt was the land of magic. So yeah, so that's to answer it. Okay, so I want to mention Wilhelm Reich also because Jan, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. So you were mentioning last week you read the first chapter that I put, The Trap of the Murder of Christ. What did you find interesting about that?
Well, generally it's a very interesting text. It's like 15 pages and it has like a lot of huge ideas in those 15 pages, I believe.
Yes, that,
And regarding religion, so he talks about this human trap. From those 15 pages, I don't really know how to interpret it, but it is this like existential condition that we have been trying to, that in his opinion we ought to escape, but our civilization was built around making ourselves comfortable in this trap. So
yes,
by science, like science, for example, makes us understand the trap more. And this trap, I'm not sure what it is. It's some kind of like suffering inherent in human beings. And
yeah,
maybe you can tell me more about it. But important, what he thinks about religion is that in a shortly, religion serves us firstly as a tool to make us comfortable in a trap. So it's in this sense, it's like an illusion of well-being that we have. It provides us with with points of I don't know how to say, like something to follow to feel well and forget about the trap. And it
yeah,
also, yeah, and he then talks about Jesus, like how Jesus was the example of someone escaping the trap, looking beyond the average human ignorant thinking. And then he talks about Jesus being killed, sacrificed for the ignorant people. And so in this way, he thinks that we ought to escape the trap by putting altering our perception, but I am not sure how. And he also draws a distinction between the ideals of Jesus and the way that religion functions now, and he finds it somehow uh, ironic, let's say. That's what I got from it.
yeah. No, those are all good points. I would love to. Yeah, I recommend you do read that chapter. It's quite short, and yeah, some of the things you mentioned. So the way religion kind of serves this trap, this societal trap of serving, maintaining the status quo, making us feel virtuous and good citizens. And in order to understand Reich's theories more, you have to understand what he believes. And so some of the ideas that he has, and he has a great book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism that I often assign when I teach political psychology. I assign many of the chapters from that book. But basically, this idea of denying nature and also, um, you know, creating this artificial and limited functioning human being. So, and again, if you read Reich, his ideas are very similar to Freud, but he believes that unlike Freud, we're essentially good deep inside, but we have a veil of I don't want to say evil, but of illusions and things that hold us back, and our inside, our unconscious drives are actually pushing us to be a better or a more fully functional human being. Now, he was again like fully on. And last week or 2 weeks ago when we talked about Jung, I mentioned that Jung was not a big fan of the sexual theories that Freud had. Well, unlike Jung, Reich was huge fan and actually was more Freudian than Freud at times in terms of the sexual theories. And one of the things that he said, and one of my favorite quotes from Reich, is the body is the unconscious. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if we look at how our body is and where we have tensions, where we have various blocks, and we work on that, our mind starts to change with it. So the mind and body is one. It's not separated. And by the way, he was the one who was the first to do body work in psychology. So today it's quite widespread. You do body work exercises in psychology, but he was the first. And unfortunately, Reich has a bad reputation because of his theories on argon and weather. Like, he designed these weather changing cannons. He was censored. He was imprisoned. He was persecuted by the Nazis. He was persecuted then in the United States when he was living there. So he was a very controversial figure. But unfortunately, so his ideas are controversial, but his work, if you read his manuscripts of body work, they have everything there. It was like William James I was mentioning. If you read the Principles of Psychology, you'll find most everything that we study in psychology today. Well, if you read the manuscripts of body work from Reich, you find almost all the issues that have been expanded upon. So like Levine's theory, waking the tiger, those, or even EMDR, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, those were all in there. Those are just a small part of Reich's theories. But anyways, he, like, by doing this, so what he was doing in body work was to undo the tensions, and he called these tensions the character armor. And they're basically the same as defense mechanisms, but he said you cannot just work on them on a mental plane. You have to work on them in the body as well. And he believed in the role of good orgasms as well, in terms of empowering or being in good mental health. That if you're blocking, if you have sexual blocks as well, it can create mental health issues. He did a lot of exercises that were related to thought and tension, like tension release. And if you were in class, I would show you some of them, which are quite effective, especially if you're about to give a speech or do something that you're nervous about. In terms of, so here's this I've already mentioned. In terms of religion, he looked at, again, similar to Freud, the system of control, and he was very interested in these guilt, like the system of guilt that can be created, as well as the compensation. So, for example, some people, like one way of looking at it, there's the excessive guilt in a religious person, there might be a compensation of some sort that could be quite perverted. For example, that could be one, or could be like extremely physical, or it's compensating one area for the other. Let's see, serving, the archetypal figures we had as well. Now, he, like, his ideas on our functioning and as being brainwashed relate to not living to the full extent that we can. That the human being is extremely powerful, but we are limited by these brainwash formulas, and they're not just religion. Reich writes about the societies, and but he always goes back to the idea of energy and of sexual repression as being one of the key parts of control. And you can read that not just in religious writings, but also if you read George Orwell's 1984, there's a lot about that as well. In the totalitarian society, we have the control of sex and the banning, they say, eventually we will even abolish the orgasm. So as a form of giving full your consciousness, your energy to the state. This would be, Reich wrote a lot about sexual energy and like praying, like the, let's say, the connection, the union, the oneness of sex, and as being one of the highest forms of spiritual being, spiritual experiences. And he also looked at religion as fetish. This is quite interesting. And he looks at childhood indoctrination. And this is all, you can see this as being almost identical as Freud's view of religion. But one of the things that, again, I go back to, one of the aspects that Reich was very interested in, that was the most controversial theory of Freud, was going back to that seduction theory of neurosis. But he looked at childhood abuse as being one of the main forms of religious indoctrination. Fear can be physical. He was a big proponent of banning certain religious mutilations, like circumcisions. He was against. He would say that was one of the main areas. Like, it gives you an idea of control. And a lot of his work was later expanded in sociological and social cultural studies in later years. And I will put a link up on eLearning. Okay, so the point of this, so if you're wondering, well, what would be the point of all this? Which status quo are we maintaining? Well, the point of all this is to create a system of control where there's a perpetuating system where people, like the ruling class, can have control over others. That was Reich's view of this and the connection with religion and power. Now, this we already talked about. Okay, I will stop the recording now if I find it.